My name's Christy Spire and I'm the acting team leader at the moment with our education team here at Green Adelaide. So thanks for joining us today for our 9th instalment of our seminar series, and thanks to those of you that are joining us live, but hopefully will also join us after the fact as well. So I'd also like to pay my respects to the country that we're meeting on today, even though I'm 4 floors above it. Ngadlu Tampanthi, Ngadlu Ghana, Yatanga Imperenti, which translates that we all acknowledge that we're meeting on Ghana land today. And I presume a lot of you will be coming from Ghana land, but there may be other lands that you're coming from as well. So thank you so much. Yes, so the purpose of our seminar series is really to share the great work happening around Adelaide to become cooler, greener, wilder and more climate resilient. And we know that a lot of you online are all a part of that, and Green Adelaide partners with so many people across Adelaide, and it's a privilege to work with you all. Just noting that this session is being recorded and will be available in our YouTube channel. And you're invited to ask any questions through the chat function. So unfortunately, you were not mic'd up today, so you can't interrupt our presenter, but we'll try to answer as many of those as we can at the end of the session. And we'll also be emailing out any other things and reading and actions that you can take after today's session, which, let's come to it. Today's session is about microbats. And we're going to hear from Harry Rust, who studied a Bachelor of Environmental Science, he's waving on the screen already, at the University of South Australia, and has also done an honours in ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Adelaide. So 2 unis, nice one, covered off on 2. You've only got 1 more Adelaide University to go. And while in his 3rd year of his degree, Harry completed an internship with Green Adelaide. Green Adelaide then contracted Harry to complete bat surveys, which he will be presenting on today and which form part of his honours thesis. Today, Harry is working in the technology and bioacoustics industry, which I love that term. I'm keen to hear more about that. So a little bit of background and just how the session will flow today before I hand over to Harry. But yeah, Australia is home to a huge diversity of bats with over 90 species found across the country. And these microbats are often overlooked and are an extremely important part of our ecosystem, with roles in pollination and pest control. So in this session, Harry will focus on the city-dwelling microbats found throughout Adelaide, exploring the habitats they like, the techniques we use to monitor their populations, and how we can all best live alongside these helpful creatures of the night. You'll hear an intro to microbats and how they're monitored, like I just said, and we'll look at each species found in Adelaide and how they're going and what we can do. So Harry's got about 40 minutes prepared to take us through the story, and then we'll have 15 minutes at the end for any questions. So please, yeah, pop them into the chat as we go along, and Harry and I will take you through those at the end. But over to you, Harry, and thanks so much for joining us today. Appreciate your time.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, thanks for that introduction. I'll share my screen now.
Thank
please
you.
Let me know if you can see it, if all looks good, if you can see my screen right now.
Beautiful picture.
Very good, thank you. It's a picture by Terry Reardon, who's an awesome bat scientist from South Australia. He taught me how to do these monitoring techniques. But yeah, thanks to everyone who's come along. It's really good to see a good turnout of people interested in Adelaide and Adelaide's microbats. As we said, they are quite underappreciated, I feel, so it's awesome to see interest in them. As mentioned, I'm going to be going over a general overview of bats and why we should care about them. Then I'll be talking about what we're doing in Adelaide, specifically the monitoring that's going on right now and how we're doing it. And I'll talk about the results that we're getting from that. So I'll take you through all of the bat species that have been observed in the surveys that I've been doing, and a bit about what that means for conservation of the species. We'll be having a Q&A at the end, so please do send through any questions, and then at the end of the session, I'll do my best to answer them. They don't have to necessarily be about Adelaide's bats. I like talking about bats in general, but of course, Adelaide is the species which I'm going to know the best. So, bats. Why do we care about them? They are super interesting. The reason I like to study them is because there's just so many directions you can take with the study of bats. They're the only flying mammal, so of course you can look at things like aerodynamics and their wing structures. They're very complex social structures with big colonies. They have a very unique evolutionary history. We kind of have two branches of bat species. So we've got the megabats, such as this one up here, the grey-headed flying fox, which if you live in Adelaide or really Australia in general, you'll be quite familiar with. They've got these cute little faces, big eyes. These guys actually can see completely clearly. They don't use echolocation. They just use their big eyes to look around and find fruit. And then there's the microbats, which is the smaller bats, which are the ones who are using echolocation to hunt insects. And yeah, this echolocation, this idea of them using sound to navigate as well as hunt, is very unique and a very interesting field of study, which when we talk about bioacoustics, that's kind of my entry point into that field of study. So I'll elaborate a bit more on how they use navigation, echolocation for navigation, and how that allows us to study the species. But I want to talk about the diversity of bat species, because they're really very diverse. There's over 1,400 species across the world, and those species really vary pretty dramatically in their appearance as well as their behavior. I've got two examples here, and I've included lots of examples of my favorite bat species, and I've tried to include where they're from, where I can. You can see the difference between these two species. This is the bumblebee bat, or Kitty's hognose bat, which is a really small bat found in Thailand and Myanmar. And you can compare this to the giant golden-crowned flying fox, which is the largest bat in the world. And their wingspan gets to 1.5 meters, so they're absolutely huge compared to this tiny little bat here. And these ones you might have seen before. There was a famous photo going around with a really big one of those. So yeah, they're found everywhere in the world, basically everywhere except like the South and North Pole. They make up a huge portion of urban mammals, which is really interesting for people doing conservation work within cities. They vary greatly in size and morphology, as you can see, and they adapt pretty differently to different environments. And yeah, these species, some of them are doing very well, and some of them are really struggling. Even in Australia, we have had a species of bat go extinct around 2008, the Christmas Island pipistrelle. So we really want to avoid this at all costs. And the way we're going to do that is by understanding these species better. So I think everyone here understands that bats are very cool, and we would love to see them conserved, but some people do need a bit more convincing. So if you want to get like an anthropological, what are the benefits of having bat species around? The main two are pollination. They're really great pollinators for a lot of plant species. For some species, they're the only pollinators. For example, the blue agave plant is purely pollinated by bats, and that is what gets us tequila. So I'm sure you can all see the benefit in that, as well as durian. I know in Australia we don't really eat durian as much as some places in Southeast Asia and places like that, but of course it's a very important food source for many people. And there's some temperate rainforest trees in Australia that are also exclusively pollinated by bats. As well as that, the pest suppression that bats provide is very, very important. And I will say, I'm homesick today, so my voice sounds a little stuffy. Please forgive me. But yeah, they have a huge dollar value in terms of how much they suppress agricultural pests across the world. There was a big and quite famous study in America where they valued bats at over $2.3 billion saved in what they would otherwise have to spend in pesticides, as well as what they'd lose in crop loss because of agricultural pests which these bats suppress. So of course they're very valuable. Here's another two bats, which I really like. This is Chaplin's free-tail bat, which has this awesome little mohawk. They can actually retract that and put it out to attract mates. They're just a cool little species from Africa. And then this one is closer to home. This is a bat found in Northern Australia. You can find it in some zoos across Australia. I believe they have them in either Monarto or the Adelaide Zoo. But ghost bats, which are a completely white bat, so they look like a ghost flying through the night. I've done some work with them in the Northern Territory. They're really cool and very curious. They're the largest of any microbat species, the largest non-fruit bat species. Here's some more cute bats, but they do face some threats, these bats. Deforestation is a really big one, and particularly in South Australia, where most of the bats, they're not actually cave roosting species, they roost in trees. So deforestation has a major impact on these species. General hunting and persecution of bats, sometimes bats do have a pretty bad reputation. There is certain cultures in the world which believe them to be bad omens or evil spirits, and that has certainly hurt their survival in the wild in the past. The way in which our climate is changing is a big threat to bats, especially heat waves. Bats don't do very well in major heat stress events. Usually during a heat wave, we'll see thousands, tens of thousands of bats being killed off in one go. So it's really, really negatively impacting them. Climate change and disease is also something which has been doing a lot of damage to bat species, particularly in Europe and America. We thankfully don't have white nose syndrome, which is a very harmful disease that some bats carry. Thankfully, we don't have that in Australia yet, but we need to monitor things like this in our biosecurity. So yeah, of course, we need to understand bats as best as we can so we can protect them from these threats. So here are two more bats in this general overview section that I thought I'd like to show off to you guys. Honduran white bats are probably one of my favorite bats, probably my favorite international bat. You can see here they're very sweet, and they make these tents out of leaves. They're found in the Philippines, these ones. And then this bat I think is really interesting too. This is a Siberian bat, and it's got the longest recorded lifespan of any bat. So there was one that was tagged in 1964, I believe, and then they found that bat again, still living happily, flying around in 2005, which makes it at least 41 years old, but probably older. So these bats actually are very long-lived, and a lot of people don't realize that because you wouldn't think a species this small would live that long. But what are we doing in Adelaide? This is a question that I'm sure we've all asked ourselves at some point, but specifically, I want to talk about what we're doing in Adelaide in our monitoring of bat species. So I've been surveying 60 sites, and I've done this over 4 seasons. So last year I did summer, autumn, and spring. And this year I've been monitoring winter. I'm still doing the analysis for the winter surveys as we speak. So I'll provide more results for that. Hopefully by the end of the year, there'll be a report published. But yeah, I've been looking at 60 sites across the Green Adelaide region. As you can see here, it goes all the way from Gawler down to Aldinga. So it does cover a huge range, mostly in this kind of city metropolitan area, but also into the foothills and up around here with the more agricultural sites. So it's been interesting. There's 9 different habitat types which we've defined within this project. So we're looking at the highly urbanized sites in the CBD, a few industrial sites, large remnant patches. So that's talking about remnant vegetation, places like Belair National Park where it's older vegetation. Looking at peri-urban sites, and that's quite important. I'll touch on that later. Peri-urban sites being mostly backyards around the foothills. Additionally, suburban sites in leafy suburbs and non-leafy suburbs or treeless suburbs, more around the inner city, So yeah, these are all different people's, mostly consisting of people's backyards. Primary agriculture, predominantly up north and a little bit down south with orchards and whatnot. It is agricultural sites, of course, farms, sometimes vegetables and plants, sometimes cattle and other animals. I've been looking at urban parks and reserves, and finally, I've been looking at coastal and wetland sites. And the aims of this study is to determine the species diversity and the composition of these bat populations across the whole of Adelaide City. This is actually the first time that Adelaide has been comprehensively surveyed for bats. So it's been a really awesome project to be involved with in that regard. So we want to determine which factors associated with urbanization, so urban development, might be affecting bats and where they are choosing to live. So things like light pollution, increased heat, reduced canopy cover, how those things are affecting bat species. And that helps us determine which bat species are most sensitive and also most resilient to urban development. So which species should we dedicate our time to trying to protect? And yeah, of course, inform future action in conservation as well as the way we plan our city. So in order to collect this data, I'm using this device called a bat detector, or at least that's what we call them, bat detectors. They are devices with ultrasonic microphones, and those microphones can hear the echolocation calls of bats, which they're using for navigation and hunting, as I mentioned. So essentially, when a bat flies over, this device listens for that ultrasonic call. When it hears it, it switches on, it starts recording for as long as that bat is calling. And then when it's silent, the device turns back off and that recording is stored on an SD card. And then I can use those recordings to identify which species is which. So I'll kind of show you two examples of that. So these are two species which we have in South Australia. I'm from Stirling. These species are both found around that area, around my backyard, which is cool. This one's the white-striped free-tail bat, and I'll give you some more information on him later. This is a species which is adapted generally to the plains, so open grasslands, or sometimes if it is in a vegetated area, it will fly above the canopy. And because of that, it has this really low frequency call. Comparatively, we have the large forest bat, which isn't very large. It's actually a very small bat, but these guys are adapted for living in densely vegetated areas. They live generally around the Adelaide Hills, where they're kind of flying in and out of bushes and shrubs, chasing mosquitoes and moths and other insects. And these guys have a comparatively quite high-pitched call. So these white-striped free-tails is about 10 kilohertz, whereas the large forest bat is about 45 to 50 kilohertz. And the reason for that, and you don't really need to understand this presentation, but just to give you a bit of insight into how this work is done, when I see a low frequency call, that tells me that it is a species adapted to open plains, because a low frequency sound travels further. So they're kind of sending out this long distance radar to find as many moths and mosquitoes and other bugs in the open air. The downside of a low frequency call is that the kind of image that the bat sees with echolocation that it sees is less precise. Whereas by doing a higher frequency call, the call won't travel as far, but the detail that the bat is able to perceive from that call is much greater. So when it's a bat that needs to duck and weave, a high frequency call is preferable over a low frequency call. Like I say, you don't really need to understand that in great detail, but that's just an example of how we identify species based on their echolocation. So what are we actually finding? And I hope I'm not going too fast or too slow. Please tell me if I am. Some of the general trends we've observed is we've seen 9 species of bat throughout Adelaide City, which I think is quite good for an urban area, particularly an urban area where we have no caves, where all of the bats are tree roosting species. I think 9 microbat species is actually quite diverse. And there's another species which is unconfirmed. I won't talk about him really much at all. That's one's called Vesperdalis babistocki, which is an inland forest bat. Those ones look really similar in the way they call to another bat, so it's kind of hard to confirm that one way or the other. My thinking is he's probably more around the Flinders Ranges, but 9 species confirmed and 1 potentially suspected. Of course, in highly urbanized areas, places like the CBD, we did see less diversity of microbats, which we would expect. That's the same as we would see in any city, generally speaking. Something which was interesting and quite unique to Adelaide, which we observed, was there were less microbat species around the coast. And it seems the reasoning for that is because there's just been a lot of clearance around the Adelaide coastline, and that's why there's been a lot of vegetation clearance. But yeah, something that is kind of in contrast to what has been observed in places like Sydney and Melbourne. Something which was very, very interesting and absolutely not expected was that in summer and autumn, when looking at the areas with the highest diversity of species, of microbat species, it was actually peri-urban backyards that had the most bats on average. So that was at times even higher than our national parks, which is really promising. That shows us that we can live very, very happily alongside microbats. I think anyone who's lived around the Adelaide Hills or even just visited Adelaide Hills and the Adelaide foothills will know it's a really beautiful area to live, and evidently the bats think so too. There was an interesting observation in that during spring, the diversity of microbats as a whole, and in particular in backyards, actually reduced, and the diversity of microbats in our national parks, in remnant vegetation sites, actually increased. So there is a movement of bat species from a more general kind of habitat into more specifically into remnant vegetation during the spring. And right now we can't kind of prove one way or the other why it is that they do that. It's suspected it may be due to maternity. So perhaps the bats prefer to raise their pups, their little babies, in areas which are more remnant vegetation, are more traditional kind of forests, as opposed to more urban sites. And in looking at the individual factors that affected where each bat was located, generally they were all very different reasons. They were attracted by different things, but the one factor that was consistent for all bat species is that they were deterred by light pollution. So going into this study, it wasn't really known whether light pollution would have kind of a overall completely negative impact on bat species, or whether some would actually prefer light pollution because it attracts moths. But based on the evidence provided through this study, it seems that no matter what species of bat it is, they actually were put off by light pollution. So here are some maps of the general diversity of microbat species. As you can see, they're kind of like more prevalent around the foothills. You also see hotspots up around the northern areas in the agricultural sites. And generally agricultural sites in Adelaide were quite good at harbouring bat species. Bats weren't generally put off too much by the agricultural sites in Adelaide, and that's something that is quite unique to Adelaide. Studies done in America have found the opposite, that agricultural development was devastating for bats, whereas in Adelaide they seem to be doing okay with it, and I would think that's because we are still keeping quite our agricultural sites are still quite well vegetated, and there's not perhaps as much native vegetation clearance as in some other states in other parts of the world. So that was a positive result. And yeah, kind of along the coast, there's less so bat species, and closer to the CBD, generally, we observed less bat species. So now I'll take you through all of the individual bats. This one is the Gould's wattlebat. These ones are doing extremely well. These guys are not really put off by urban development at all, and they will live very happily alongside people. They are our most common species in Adelaide, one of the most common in Australia. They were present in almost every survey that I did. During the season of summer, I actually found these bats at every single site I went to, which included sites which were like one of the sites I went to was an apartment in the CBD, and that was 18 floors up, and we had Gould's wattlebat visiting that site, or at least just passing through. And surprisingly, there was actually a positive correlation between areas with high building density and the presence of Gould's wattlebat. So perhaps they're taking advantage of the fact that other bats don't necessarily like high building density, so there's more insects for them to hunt there. But yeah, these guys are doing quite well. And generally, if you put up bat boxes, so when I talk about bat boxes, basically it's these wooden structures. If you've ever seen, bird boxes and possum boxes, it's these wooden structures that you can put up in your backyard. And generally, if you're going to get bats in those, it'll be these Gould's wattlebat. So some people are a bit pessimistic and say, oh, you're just helping a species that's already got plenty of places to live. But if you put up these bat boxes and these Gould's wattlebat all move into there, that frees up some of the other habitat, like tree hollows, for other species who are a bit more picky to make their roost there. So yeah, these guys are adapted to plains. So of course the Adelaide Plains, and they do all right in arid lands as well. And something also unique about the species is that they give birth to twins, whereas every other bat, or at least most other bats in South Australia, will only give birth to one pup a year. So already the fact that they give birth to twins, so they give birth to twins once every year, that's already doubled their population resilience because of that. Now getting into some of the species which aren't benefiting from urbanization, certainly, but aren't really as threatened by it as other species. Some of our urban adapted species. Number one is the white-striped freetail bat. So this is a cool bat. He's quite large. He's got quite a large wingspan for a microbat, for an insect-eating bat. Sorry about that. This is the one I showed you before, which has this really low frequency call. Their calls are about 10 kilohertz. And that call is actually audible to the human ear. So as you can see, he's quite well spread out through the city. And I would say the vast majority of people living in Adelaide would get this bat passing through their backyard, having a munch on some mosquitoes and moths and other insects and beetles and whatnot. So you can actually hear these guys if your hearing's good. I've got a audio clip here. Hopefully you can hear it. Maybe you won't be able to. So it's a really kind of it's high pitched for us. It's kind of like a ting 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 sound, like if you kind of rub two spoons together or rub two pieces of metal together. That's kind of what they sound like. So you might be able to hear these guys at night foraging for insects. But yeah, these guys are doing quite well. Let's play the sound again. Let me just go on. Yes. This is our next urban adapted species. These guys were absolutely everywhere, kind of similar to the Gould's wattlebat, especially in summer. These guys are all over the place. They are the southern free-tailed bat. This is another bat that is adapted to the plains kind of area, to plains, grasslands, and as a result, all of these species which are more evolved to the open airspace generally did quite well, because a city is kind of an open airspace. So yeah, these guys were found across the majority of sites, especially in summer. And something which was interesting within this study, and I'll elaborate on why it's interesting in a moment, is because there was a positive correlation between where these species were active and where they were passing through, and areas of high rainfall. So generally they were found in areas with higher rainfall. And the reason that's interesting is because there's this other species, the inland free-tailed bat, which is very, very similar. The insects which they hunt are very similar. The frequency in which they call is very similar. So you would kind of imagine if these guys are in the same area, there would be a lot of competition between these two species. But what was interesting in this study is that while the southern free-tailed bat was positively correlated with areas of high rainfall, the inland free-tailed bat was positively correlated with areas of low rainfall. So perhaps that's a way that they're avoiding competition with each other. This species, it wasn't found much in this study, but that's not really setting off any alarm bells, because these guys are an arid land species. They're a species that's generally found in the desert. They're usually found within South Australia. They're found in the Flinders Ranges. There just happens, it appears that there happen to be a few coming down more south, just to give us a visit during the summer months, as well as there are a few in spring and autumn as well. And finally, of the urban adapted species, we have this bat called the lesser long-eared bat. This is a very cute bat species, in my opinion. That's my #1 dot point. I like their little faces. Anyway, these guys, despite the fact that they're quite reliant on vegetation, they were still observed in a quite a different range of sites. They do change their roost quite often. So yeah, sometimes they would be hanging out around here in the foothills, and then maybe they'll stay for a week or two, and then they'll move up somewhere around into someone's backyard for a bit, stay for a week or two, and then move somewhere else. More so in spring, they're a bit more picky. They are reliant on vegetation. In particular, they're reliant on dead logs, particularly hollow logs, which is where they like to raise their babies. They often, when they're not in a maternity roost, their little temporary roosts, they'll hang out in between the bark of trees, in between the bark and the trunk. So they're very small species. So kind of with that, with their reliance on dead hollow logs, that's kind of something that people might not appreciate, that things like a dead tree can actually be a very important resource for a lot of species. So it's not always a good idea to remove those from your backyard if you do have dead trees and dead logs, unless it is, of course, posing a safety threat to you. Then if you can keep it around, it's a good idea to do so. These guys do travel quite a long way. They can fly 12 kilometers in the pursuit of tasty insects. So they do travel around quite a lot, these guys. Now moving on to the more sensitive species, the urban avoiders. There was 4 species. There were 2 that were kind of definitely, confidently put within this category, the idea of them being an urban avoider, so avoiding urbanization and urban development. 2 which were a bit harder to study using acoustics alone, just using their calls, because they look very similar. I'll touch on them. Yeah, this large forest bat, like I mentioned, it's not very large. I included this photo because it's really good for showing the size of this species, but I was hesitant to include it because this person is handling a bat without gloves, and you should really wear gloves, mostly so you don't give human germs to the bat. But these guys generally were in the more densely vegetated area. So in this case, the Adelaide foothills, and I would love to look out through more of the hills region and see whereabouts they are. Yeah, so these guys generally avoided urban development. There were some exceptions. For example, up north, like Yadalunga, there was some good backyards where they were doing really well because there was lots of vegetation there. I believe These guys have been observed hanging out in golf courses, so that can be a good refuge for these species. The Glenelg Golf Course and Grange Golf Course were both places where bats, including the large forest bat and the lesser long-eared bat, were both observed. So that can be a good refuge for them, as well as the parklands. These guys in particular were also quite reliant on fresh water, on water bodies. So it's nice for them to be somewhere where there's access to ponds and things, which they'll use to hunt for insects as well as cool down during the summer. This bat here is really similar, the southern forest bat, Vesperdalis regulus. Yeah, it's very similar, kind of observed around the same, generally the same kind of areas. These guys were a little bit more resilient. They don't really are not as fussed about having that access to fresh water. Of course, they still need it to drink, but they were a little less picky with where they chose to go, but generally very similar. So the Adelaide Hills was a really good refuge for both of these forest bat species. These guys are actually quite interesting with their South Australian population, because bats, like people, can kind of pick up an accent when their population is isolated from other populations of the same species. So in South Australia, this bat calls at about 40 kilohertz, which is about 10 kilohertz lower than southern forest bats from Sydney, which is where I'm living now, and as well as the ones in Perth. They also call around 50 kilohertz. In Victoria, it kind of varies where you are, but this South Australian Vesperdalis regulus is interesting because it does kind of call in a unique way, and perhaps wouldn't be able to communicate with the southern forest bat populations from interstate. Another thing that makes this species important, and this is particularly relevant in Victoria, is that they are a big controller of the Rutherglen bug, which is a very big agricultural pest in Australia. So 2 more bats, I'm just checking on time. Yeah, 2 more bats before I finish. The little forest bat is another very cute bat. This one, if the large forest bat was small, this one is absolutely minuscule. You can see a picture here of one sitting on someone's thumb. It's tiny. These guys are quite hard to study with acoustics because they call in a way that is almost identical to this bat, which is the chocolate wattle bat. So for that reason, it was hard to assess what is actually impacting this species. It wasn't found very much. It was quite rare. Often it was found around like the northern parts of Adelaide in these agricultural sites, as was the chocolate wattle bat. Like I say, it was hard to differentiate these species. So yeah, this species is a very cute species of bat. Generally lives in colonies of like 20, but this bat has been observed. Males from this species sometimes just like to live completely solo. They live in complete isolation, just hanging out and doing what they want. So you can see this bat here. He probably feels a bit tough. He can be a lone wolf, but yes, very sweet species. And this is finally the chocolate wattle bat. Like I say, it was quite hard to determine what was impacting this species because it's difficult to study with acoustics, and it would be awesome to do some like trapping using nets to see where these species are present. This one has quite a cute face, in my opinion, because it looks like a little pug. Maybe you might think he's a bit ugly, but he's cute and endearing, I think. These guys generally roost in trees in colonies of 10, but these guys actually have been in areas where there's been a lot of clearance of habitat. These guys will actually group up in colonies of up to 1,000, living in abandoned buildings if they can't find tree hollows to roost in. That particular finding was in a study in Perth. So we really want to provide as many tree hollows as possible. So when I talk about tree hollows, I just mean the kind of like holes in trees where animals will roost, which is very important for bats in Adelaide. And that includes in dead trees, not just living trees. So if you have tree hollows on your property, please do take care of them and don't remove them unless you absolutely have to, because they're a really good refuge for bats. And yeah, bats will be happy to live in your backyard. You don't need to be afraid of them. If you want to talk about, if you've got things that make you scared of bats, we can talk about it during the Q&A. But yeah, they're not a species to be afraid of, or not a family of species to be afraid of. So please do. Here's some implications for our conservation of these species. The number one takeaway, I think, from this work being done in Adelaide is that it shows that humans and microbats can coexist very happily, because we're still getting a very high diversity of bat species in residential areas. In places like cherry gardens and other places around the foothills. And generally, the areas where these bats prefer to live is areas with high vegetation cover, with low levels of light pollution, and with lower building density. So to keep them happy, it's awesome if we can plant diverse vegetation. So vegetation that is not just trees, but trees, shrubs, and grasses, to provide that kind of diverse vegetation for them. Flowering shrubs in particular are very good, because flowering shrubs will attract the moths and insects that these bats like to eat. And of course, hollow-bearing trees are extremely important. It does take a long time for trees to start getting hollows that are suitable for bats. So if you can protect the hollow-bearing trees that we do have around Adelaide, that's extremely important. And this kind of action is really needed in non-leafy suburbs and in industrial areas. So things like community planting days are very important for conserving microbat species, because, as we've observed, they don't take that much to be happy. It's just having that vegetation there, letting them have places to roost, and an abundant population of insects. So things like green infrastructure. So when I say green infrastructure, that's things like green walls or green roofs. So planting on building rooftops could be really beneficial for these bats. Planting on walls during in the really densely vegetated densely urbanized parts of the city could really benefit bats. And just taking advantage of areas we do have, like the parklands, would be really beneficial. So that's it feels like it's gone by very quickly, but that's a crash course on Adelaide's bats and what bat species we have flying around our city. I think I've taken the 40 minutes, although it hasn't quite felt like it, but.
Yeah, I think we're around that mark, but yeah, no, that's fantastic. What an awesome deep dive, and it's great to to hear someone tell the story of their work with such passion and depth. So that that's good that it's gone fast for you. But yeah, it's a lot of information to take in for those that are new to it. But like Rachel said in the comments here, fantastic presentation. And sorry, I'm just getting out of the light here. And has definitely increased my understanding and affection for microbats, because I suppose they're one of those species that, if a lot of people don't see them or hear them, and so to have all those fantastic images and increasing our understanding in that way is just fantastic, and lots of take homes and reminders of how we can think about them in our backyards and across the urban landscape as well. So we've got a few questions here, and happy for people to keep putting a few in. We've got about 10 minutes to go till 5. So a few kind of minor questions around can they actually be blinded by the bright lights? I'm not sure if you mentioned that when you were talking about the light pollution, but is it just that they're scared of it, or
most for a lot of species, it's a thing of that they are kind of scared of going into bright light. For example, especially the species which can't fly very fast. The lesser long-eared bat is one of those. The one with the big ears. He's one of those species where they fly really slow. So they think if they go into a bright area, which in nature is areas with lots of moonlight, that they'll get snatched up by owls. which is fine
Yes.
to avoid light. In terms of, do they
So
get?
it doesn't actually affect their sight.
It may do, but because their navigation through echolocation is so good, even if a bat loses its eyes in some accident, they can still see.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
they do use their eyesight, so I believe it would be quite off-putting for the bats.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, totally. It's more of that, just survival instinct kicking in around the light pollution. And another one, Kia wanted to hear the call, which you tried to, but I don't think we could quite hear it. So we'll make sure that we email that out to everybody so they can hear some calls. And also, Kia's interested in how the white colour benefits the bats that have that colouring on them.
Yeah. So I would think that's in reference to the ghost bat, which is completely white.
Yes.
Yeah. As for that, I'm not entirely sure because I haven't done studied that kind of side of things. But the ghost bats are pretty undisturbed by most animals. They are a large bat species, which they hunt things like mice and frogs and sometimes other bats. So they're quite like a high up on the food chain. So yeah, it may be something to do with the way they attract mates, or maybe it's because of the caves in which that is a cave roosting species. Maybe that helps them blend in with the rock surface within caves. But yeah, it'd be interesting to do more work looking at that.
Yeah, yeah. And some questions around, and you mentioned the importance of the hollows and dead trees and creating those places in the urban areas. From Amy, is there any value in installing bat boxes in urban areas if they are actually deterred by light pollution? Like, would it be better to promote the use of these in peri-urban backyards where there's more remnant vegetation and food that they can find? I suppose.
I mean, I would say they're valuable everywhere, really. It's primarily going to be giving habitat to Gould's wattlebat, which are not a threatened species, but like I say, that can open up those roosts that do exist. If the Gould's wattlebat are moving out of there and into these bat boxes, that could become a good refuge for them. But in areas where there is high light pollution, even the Gould's wattlebat, which are very resilient species, they are still put off by that light. So having the bat box where it is a dark environment for them could be really beneficial, and it will help prevent them from making a roost in buildings where they might have conflict with people.
Yeah, no worries. And we've got an awesome resource around bat boxes and that kind of thing that we can send out to everyone to help them think through that and which would be the best locations and what areas you need to do that. For people that are wanting to try and get out there and actually see the bats, Harry, what time of night are they most active, and what would you kind of suggest people do?
Sunset is when they're most active. Just in terms of what should you do to find them, just be aware that they are there, because a lot of the time we actually do see them flying around, but because we're not used to seeing and acknowledging bats, we just think it's a bird or a moth. Some of them, because the bats are very small, so sometimes they do look like moths. They have like quite a unique way of flying where they're when you see a bat flying versus a bird, you can kind of tell the difference. And although this is not a microbat, going to the Botanic Park is a great way to see the grey-headed flying fox colony. I think we're quite lucky to have over 20,000 grey-headed flying foxes in that colony.
It's amazing, isn't it? Yeah. Kia was saying that I found most footy ovals at night have microbats, so maybe that's a good spot to try and find a local footy oval. Yes. That's interesting. Yeah.
With it being an open space, it'd be quite good to get spotting them.
Yeah, except for when the lights are on. But yeah, that shouldn't be for the next season at least. We've headed over onto cricket season, so it might be a good time to get out. And are there any particular species of trees and bark that I know that you mentioned that some of them like to roost in there. Are there any in particular, or
I'm not sure.
Or did you didn't focus on that particular side of it in your research?
Yeah, for me, like, because there was a lot of factors being studied, wasn't looking at the specific type of trees which these bats were more going for. I would love to see that study being done. I don't think a study of that type has been done in South Australia.
There you go, researchers online. Yeah.
Yeah, and certainly native species over introduced species.
Yeah. And yeah, there was was your research able to help gauge the population levels as well in each of the areas? Like, I know that you kind of mapped them out in terms of where they're appearing. So did you actually do the number crunching side of it as well, or is that too difficult? Yeah.
So with the way that we use bioacoustics, the way we use sound to monitor these animals, we can gauge the kind of activity level of species within an area, but it's much more difficult to kind of get an exact estimate of a number, because we don't know whether if we have, say, 40 calls recorded in one night from one particular species in an area, we don't know if that's 30 bats flying over, or if that's one bat that is very interested in our bat detector and is just
yes, yeah.
So it's hard to say. We get rough estimates for activity, and I think generally activity is highest in areas such as the foothills and agricultural sites, as well as the national parks. So that's probably where they're foraging and not just passing through.
And another interesting question that's just popped in: is there much competition with bees or anything else for hollows? And do bats hibernate?
Yeah. So in terms of competition for hollows, perhaps it's not something that I've observed, but maybe other people have. With their hibernation, they have something very similar to hibernation called torpor, which is where they kind of shut down basically all of their bodily functions, and their body heat is regulated by the temperature around them, which is actually a big part of why tree hollows are so important for bats, because those tree hollows provide a generally pretty consistent climate, which is regulated by being that internal space. So they go into torpor during the day and then come out at night. They don't have a extended hibernation period, or at least the species that I've been working with in South Australia don't.
Yeah, great, awesome. And there's another question is around cats. Are cats a threat at all to bats? Like, what are the predators, I suppose, in the urban environment for bats?
Yeah, cats they have been observed hunting and injuring bats. So like pretty much anyone in the ecology field will tell you in Australia, you should try and keep your cats inside. The other things which may be hunting bats would be things like birds of prey, but generally those birds are part of the natural ecosystem. For introduced predators, yeah, cats are the biggest one.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and my apologies, you might have said this at the beginning as well. Was your study quite a unique one in terms of in an urban city for Australia? Like, have you shared it further afield with other cities, or have other cities done anything similar?
Yeah, it's Australia's kind of the research that's been done on bats in Australia is not uniform at all. Like, there's been a lot of work in New South Wales.
Okay.
And there's been studies done in Brisbane and Melbourne as well. there is a lot of work being done right now in Perth, which is just starting up, and across all of Western Australia, which is really very impressive. And yeah, I'd recommend looking into. That'd be awesome to see. They're getting a monitoring program, which would be awesome to see a similar thing done in South Australia. But what makes bat research hard in South Australia and many other states, particularly with acoustics, is that the information for what each bat sounds like, for what its calls are like, are not public. I'm hoping to make some of the calls which I used as references within this study. I'm hoping to make them public when I publish this data.
Right.
Yeah, right now it's quite difficult for students to get into bat research in South Australia, and there is similar issues in Central Australia and for now in Western Australia. But like I say, that's getting a lot better, and yeah, even Victoria. But there is a lot of work being done by scientists across Australia right now to make that data more publicly available and to reduce that barrier of entry into bat.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, there's always complexities in whatever you're researching, but that's the particularly unique one to this. To this area. Yeah, that's great. And yeah, Harry, just before we close off, what was for you, what was the most kind of exciting thing, or the thing that motivated you out of the study that you did the most?
I think it was just the enthusiasm from everyone who I asked to study, to do surveys for bats. I didn't get turned down by a single person, and some of the times I was calling up just businesses within industrial areas, and I say, hey, I know this is going to sound weird, but can you let me onto your roof so I can put up a microphone and listen for bats? And they're all like, yeah, that sounds awesome. Please come and tell us all about it. And there was just
fantastic.
Yeah, enthusiasm from everyone I talked to. So that's really what we like to hear.
Fantastic. Yeah, so a collective effort. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so yeah, we can't wait to keep sharing your research and sharing that enthusiasm so that people know about it a little bit more, and to be able to research. And as you did that, the businesses and so forth would have probably learned a little bit along the way, or at least try and follow it up once you've shared it. So thanks again for joining us today, Harry. We were right on time. We've done well. And thanks to everyone else for participating that's watched it live or will watch it later. We will send out a follow-up email with relevant links and references, and maybe to that other national research as well. And for those of you that haven't joined our Green Adelaide mailing list, we encourage you to do that, because we send out little reminders of seminar series and all the things that are happening. And we understand that your emails and calendars get very overloaded, so we try and keep those short, sharp and shiny. And our last talk in this series for 2023 is Saving Our Threatened Plant Species on Wednesday the 22nd of November from 4 to 5 p.m. So we'll send out further information about that and another link so that you can all jump in, and we'll let you know when this one is nice and live and shareable with all your friends and family as well. So thank you, everyone. And get outside and enjoy that lovely sunshine. I was hearing all the birds in your backyard or wherever you're calling in from, Harry. Sounded great through the presentation as well. So thank you all again. And if you've got any other questions, feel free to email us. And thanks to Nat Giffney from all the behind the scenes work to getting these seminars up and live. So see you all again at the next one.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for everyone who attended.
Pleasure.